Hello and welcome along. So recently I've been reading Born in Flame, which is one of the Horus Heresy books centered around Vulcan and the Salamanders. And within that, there's a story where Vulcan is on a joint campaign with Mortarion and Ferrus Manus. And in this campaign, it's very clear that Ferrus Manus is the leader. He is clearly the person that the other two have to report to, have to default to in final decisions, although they discussed what they'll do and they kind of do what they want at certain times. It is clearly Ferrus Manus who is in charge. And it got me thinking about the relative levels of seniority amongst the Primarchs before the heresy. So during the Great Crusade, when they were tasked with completing the Emperor's plan of reconquering the galaxy, who were the Primarchs that took the lead and that were most likely to be in charge in joint operations? Now, of course, Horus was number one, and he was number one for a multitude of reasons, which you don't need to go into here, but that's just the reality he was, and that's why he became War Master. So if he was present, generally he would be in charge of the other Primarchs. And Sanguinius was a de facto number two. So Horus and Sanguinius were extremely close for a start, and they would often make decisions together. And this was mainly because Sanguinius was simply that good. It was his individual brilliance in all aspects that made him stand out above his brothers. And his close relationship with Horus meant that he was pretty much always a de facto number two option. So if Horus wasn't present, Sanguinius was. It would be him that his brothers would defer to. And it was him that most other people thought should have been War Master if it wasn't Horus. And even Horus himself thought that. So Sanguinius and Horus are obviously the top two. And generally you can see this throughout the stories of the Great Crusade, that the other Primarchs defer to them. Even during the heresy, it's Sanguinius that the other Primarchs, the loyalist Primarchs, look to be the counterweight to Horus. When Guilliman and the Lion think that the Emperor is dead, it's Sanguinius that becomes the new Emperor in the Imperius Secundus. In fact, he's the only brother that most of them would tolerate as being above them. So given that, who were the other Primarchs that generally took the lead in operations? Now, we've got Ferrus Manus as a good example, so let's start with him. So clearly, Ferrus Manus was in charge of some joint operations, and of course, he was given de facto command over the Retribution fleet sent to bring Horus to heel, or probably kill him at this point, because the Imperium has just discovered what he's done on Isstvan III. And so it's Manus that takes up the mantle of leader of the loyalists. Now, he does do this in the absence of some of the other obvious candidates. Obviously, Sanguinius is not present, Dorn's not present, Guilliman's not present, the Lion's not present, and Leman Russ is not present. But all the other loyalists are there, and half of the traitors are there, and he is given command. Well, he doesn't really get given command, he just takes it. He's like, I'm obviously in charge. He doesn't need to say it, he just does it. He just starts leading them, and they have to do what he says. They don't have to, but they just kind of do. They just go along with it. And it's his terrible plan that leads to the most of them getting killed. So he's not the greatest general in the world, but he is very forceful. He can make people do what he wants. So not the best for the Imperium, having someone who's so full of self-confidence and so driven to take action that you have clearly quite a poor decision maker like Ferrus Manus making quite a lot of decisions. But the fact is, he did take up that role many times. And at this key moment in Imperial history, the point when the greatest son has been shown to be a traitor, it's him that takes up that mantle to go and set things right. And now you could say, well, half of those people that went with him, half of those Primarchs that were with him, were actually secretly traitors. And so they didn't step up. They didn't need to step up and become the leader because he was doing exactly what they wanted him to do. So they maybe just stood back in the shadows and let him fail. But obviously the other loyalist Primarchs that were there, Vulcan and Corax, they deferred to him, as Vulcan had done in the previous campaign that started me thinking of this. And the traitors that were there were not ones that had ever shown any signs of being put in charge of any other joint campaigns. I think even if they had been loyalists and not secretly waiting for Manus to fail, they wouldn't have taken command. It was his right to be in command. That was just the way it was. That was the established pecking order amongst the brothers. And that probably goes down to his sheer force of personality, maybe even partly his massive physical size, To his background as a sort of warrior king, he had been used to being in charge in his own environment before joining the Imperium, and he was found very early. So he was one of the earliest brothers to be found. Off the top of my head, I think it's fourth. And so he was close to the emperor and the levers of power in the earlier days, and the others would have joined later thinking, well, we obviously defer to Manus because he just is already in charge. So perhaps that's a big part of it as well. On top of this, he also had that long-running relationship with Fulgrim as a kind of a duo, and they did campaign together quite often. And it seems like Fulgrim always kind of took the back seat slightly to Manus, and kind of Manus was the driving force, the decision maker, and Fulgrim was more like his support act. However, Fulgrim was very good at sort of manipulating seemingly more powerful people into doing what he wanted. So he did this with Horus. He was always in the background, but he wasn't put upon or controlled by Horus. And he did it with Perturabo during the heresy as well. So he would let them take the lead and kind of take the flak, and he would get his own way by maneuvering them with flattery and other means. He wasn't a weakling who was being dominated by his other brothers. He was just more strategic and diplomatic than they were, and so he was able to get what he wanted without having to dominate them. And so I think in that relationship between him and Manus, he did allow Manus to take the leading role, but nonetheless, Manus still did have the public leading role, and I'm sure in Manus's mind he was just leading. That's just the way it was. So I think Manus is probably a pretty good choice for one of the Primarchs that would be considered the senior Primarch after the duo of Horus and Sanguinius. Now, another name I want to put in the hat is Dorn. So Dorn was found roughly sort of midway through the rankings of Primarchs in terms of time found. So was around for quite a long time during the Great Crusade and managed to build up his influence within the group. He also came from a very strong leadership role in his previous life before being found by the Imperium. So he was used to leading a spacefaring empire. He wasn't the greatest at anything, but he was well respected and fiercely loyal. He was also very effective. So his legion were very effective. They won a lot of battles and they conquered a lot of worlds, and their worlds very rarely slipped back into rebellion. So he was building the empire. He was doing a great job of building the Imperium for the emperor. And he was close to the levers of power quite a lot, particularly because in the later parts of the Great Crusade, of course, he became the Praetorian of the Emperor, so he was responsible for building up the defences of Terra and protecting the solar system and the surrounding space. So that gave him a lot more influence than a lot of the other Primarchs had, because he was right there where all the decisions were being made. And when the heresy first started, he also kind of takes on a de facto position of leader of the Loyalists, because he's on Terra, and he's sending out information to the other Primarchs that aren't there, and orders. So he's giving out orders. He is kind of being the leader amongst the loyalists. So although Ferrus was briefly that person in the field, because he took that mantle upon himself, it's Dorn that's kind of more the strategic leader of the loyalists during the heresy. Now, of course, again, he's doing that in the absence of Guilliman and the absence of Sanguinius, the absence of the Lion, because they are in various other situations that's keeping them out of the central events of the heresy. But it is Dorn that is seen as the main leader amongst the Primarchs, of the Loyalist Primarchs at this time. So he has to be a strong candidate. Also, during the Great Crusade, it was him that was de facto in charge of a joint operation between him and Conrad Kurz and Fulgrim when Conrad Kurz almost kills him. Now, obviously, Conrad Kurz almost killing him doesn't change the fact that he was he was in charge of that operation and took it upon himself to try and discipline Kurz because of Kurz's various mental problems. And now it did lead to his death, but the fact that he thought he could do that showed he was in that role as more of the senior brother amongst that group. He also built up the kind of resentment from Alpharius for doing a similar thing to Alpharius, where he talked down to Alpharius, told him he was wrong, tried to lecture him on tactics, etc. Because he again, in a joint operation with Alpharius, he thought, I'm in charge. The way your legion operates, this isn't quite right. You should be doing this like I want you to do it. And Alpharius took quite a disliking to him because of that, and held a massive grudge against him, which came out in the heresy. But nonetheless, Dorn certainly thought of himself as being the senior partner in that operation. And although Alferus didn't like the way he was treated by Dorn, he was fulfilling that role as a support act again to Dorn in that time. So I think it's fair to say Dorn was quite high up in the pecking order of the Primarchs and would often be looked to as the leader of any joint operation. It was also Dorn, of course, with Guilliman that was involved in the decision to erase the memories of the Primarchs when the lost Primarch, or at least one of the lost Primarchs, was erased from history. We don't really know what the details of that event was, but we do know that they together made that decision and kind of imposed it on the other Primarch. So that would show that both of them had a very high standing within the group at that point in terms of influence. To be clear, I'm not talking about popularity. I'm talking about their influence within the leadership of the Imperium. So moving on from Dorn, that brings us nicely to Guilliman. Now, Guilliman is often put forward as an alternative war master to Horus, and that's for two main reasons. One is he commanded the largest legion, and two, he was considered a master tactician, so it seems like he would make a good choice. But also, of course, he controlled the largest territory that constituted part of the Imperium out of the Primarch. So Ultramar was this huge area of space that he had conquered. He had this huge legion, and he was respected as a great tactician, so he makes an obvious choice. But that would also mean he makes an obvious choice to lead joint operations. So whenever the Ultramarines were within a campaign with some other legion, they were probably going to outnumber that legion. They probably had more resources than that other legion because they had more to draw on from Ultramar. And Guilliman generally was probably going to be at least as good, but perhaps a better tactician than the other Primarch he was with, and so would probably be defaulted as the leader. And so he would probably get into those situations more often than other Primarchs and be considered the leader of that joint operation. And that's why people look to him as an alternative war master. That's why he had a big role to play in the leadership of the Primarchs during the heresy, at least when he was able to communicate with them, because obviously he was isolated for a large period of that time. But in the Imperius Secundus, he did drive that idea forward. It was him who kind of put it all together from an organizational sense. And yes, he deferred to Sanguinius as the sort of rightful replacement to the Emperor, but he did retain a lot of influence. And obviously that is mainly because it was in Ultramar, so it was his own territory he was giving to become the Imperius Secundus. But he never deferred to the Lion, for example, in terms of command decisions. He gave the Lion power over some military decisions because he wanted to do things right. He didn't want to be a dictator, and so he realized that once he'd given the Lion control over military decisions, he had to let that follow through to whatever the Lion decided. But he couldn't contemplate letting the Lion be above him or in charge of the Imperium. So, and the Lion is another very senior Primarch, and so Guilliman's inability to defer, to take the second, to step back and accept the seniority of the Lion shows that his own impression of himself as a more senior Primarch was considerable. And I think when you put all that together, he has to be, along with Dorn, strong choice for who was the most senior out of the other Primarchs. And although there aren't really any direct examples of major campaigns where he led the other Primarchs, it is clear that he would have often led them. We haven't been given those details. And of course, it was Guilliman that the Emperor chose to help him discipline Lorgar when Lorgar got out of hand with his Emperor worship. And that obviously led to Lorgar having a massive vendetta against Guilliman, and eventually leading to Guilliman nearly being killed. Much in the same way that Dorn managed to aggravate Comrade Kurz, Lorgar always had this vendetta against Guilliman because of what happened. But Guilliman wouldn't have been chosen by the Emperor for this task if he didn't see him as one of the more senior Primarchs. Now, this brings me to my final choice for the main contenders, and that is the Lion. So the Lion, of course, is technically the first Primarch. Although he wasn't discovered first, he is numerically the first and kind of takes on the older brother role. He certainly saw himself as being the first Primarch and felt that the others should defer to him most of the time. He was in charge of what was the largest legion for a large part of the Great Crusade in the Dark Angels, and the legion that had the more senior position for a large portion of the Great Crusade. And really riding on the backs of the Dark Angels' position as a sort of preeminent legion, he took up that mantle and became very much a leader amongst the other Primarchs. he was, of course, in charge of the Rangdan Genocides, one of the biggest campaigns in the Imperium's history. And in that campaign, he was certainly senior to the other Primarchs in that campaign, which included Leman Russ, probably Alfarius, although that's somewhat disputed, and at least one of the Lost Primarchs, and of course enormous resources from the rest of the Imperial forces. But ironically, although that campaign shows his level of seniority within the Primarchs, it also was probably the reason why he was not considered a great rival to Horus to be War Master, because it damaged his reputation so much because of probably, I mean, these are all slightly disputed because of the information around that campaign is limited, but it seems like some terrible military disaster did occur. We know at least some disasters did occur in the early stages, but it seems like even bigger disasters occurred throughout the campaign, particularly the third campaign. And it seems like the Emperor had to step in to save the day. And probably at this time, the Dark Angels were reduced in number enough for the Ultramarines to surpass them as the largest legion. But it's still important to remember that the Lion was in charge of this huge campaign. He was leading other Primarchs. He was in a very senior position at this point. And he would continue to be considered as one of the more senior Primarchs throughout the Great Crusade. And during the heresy itself, he was still considered to be one of the senior Primarchs. And as I said, he did have a very strong rivalry with Guilliman, and neither of them really wanted to accept the other as above them, but they both deferred to Sanguinius, but they respected each other at some level. But they had quite a considerably different personalities, and so they couldn't ever really accept each other as above them. They did respect each other as military leaders, and I think they probably would say that they were roughly on the similar level in terms of the hierarchy of the Primarchs, but each would have thought, well, my ideas, my tactics, my way of doing things is actually a bit better than yours, so I should be the number one. So I think in a joint operation between the two, they probably would find it very difficult to determine who had the final say. However, they seem to almost never campaign together, and that's probably part of the reason. So it would be interesting to see if the Lion hadn't been so isolated during the Horus Heresy, would he have been the person that took control of the Retribution Force sent to defeat Horus? I'm not sure. I'm not certain. I think that Manus would still have taken the lead there, and the Lion would have kind of gone along with him, probably still done his own thing, but wouldn't have tried to force overall leadership, which he kind of did during Imperius Secundus with Guilliman. He kind of accepted that Guilliman could think things that were different to him, but he just did his own thing anyway in secret, and then just was like, well, what are you going to do now? So the Lion probably is never really going to take the back seat to another Primarch, other than maybe Horus and Sanguinius. But I do think he probably would just avoid the outright confrontation with either Guilliman or Manus or Dorn, and would have just kind of gone and done his own thing rather than challenge them for the leadership. So that's my four main candidates, but I have an additional honourable mention for Magnus. Now, I don't think Magnus would have taken the lead had one of those four been present, and I think they would always be the overall commander in a combined force that didn't include one of the other four, and it would be very interesting to see how it would work out with more than one of them present. But I think if Magnus was present and one of those four wasn't present, and obviously excluding Horus and Sanguinius, the rest of the Primarchs, I think, would defer to Magnus, except for, of course, Mortarion, because Mortarion hates Magnus on a deep, deep level and was so suspicious of him, he was taking his legion and gone. I don't think he would ever defer to Magnus. I should mention Leman Russ, of course. Russ have had a deep suspicion of Magnus throughout their time and probably wouldn't defer to Magnus. He did go on joint campaigns with Magnus, so he wouldn't outright walk away and refuse to fight alongside the Thousand Sons of Magnus. However, would he actually yield to Magnus's orders? That's a bit harder to say, but certainly the rest of them would. It's well known that Perturabo, Lorgar, the Khan, all had a great respect of Magnus and looked up to him and sought advice from him. So if they were in together in a campaign, they would have certainly seen Magnus as the leader. And many of the other Primarchs, that people like Alfarius, Kurz, Angrong, Korax, they aren't naturally going to take control of a large group and would defer to the person that appeared to be the leader amongst the group, which would have been Magnus in that case. So I think it's quite reasonable to say Magnus would have had a good chance of being leader of a large group of the other Primarchs in joint campaigns, as long as one of the more obvious candidates wasn't present, or one of his mortal enemies wasn't present. That's why I put him in as an honourable mention rather than one of the main candidates. So what do you think? Who would you expect to be in charge in a joint operation of the Primarchs when you exclude Horus and Sanguinius? I have given you my 4 main candidates. Which one of those do you think would take the lead if they were all present? Do you think they could ever agree for one of them to be in charge out of those 4? Probably would be quite hard for them to come to an agreement, I think. Is there someone I've missed out of that group that you think is actually one of the more senior Primarchs that would take the lead in a joint operation? So let me know what you think in the comments. As always, it's good to hear from you. And if possible, like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time.